Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. There have always been homeless people in New York City, whether they were the ones Jacob Riis photographed sleeping in alleys, dumps, and on the floors of police stations in his 1890 expose, How the Other Half Lives, or whether they were living under bridges and sleeping in Penn Station and Port Authority in the 1980s. The homeless appeared to recede for a while, but the pandemic has brought them back into public view, camped out on sidewalks, sleeping in subway cars, living in outdoor encampments, which has led Mayor Eric Adams to launch a major effort to get them off the streets and into city-run shelters. Is the mayor simply playing musical chairs with the homeless? And is anyone making an effort to bring about a lasting solution to the problem? Henry Love, a doctoral student in developmental psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center, has been studying the psychological dynamics of homelessness for years. What has he learned? What solutions does he propose? And is anyone prepared to put them into action? Welcome. Henry, the New York Times recently reported that under orders from Mayor Eric Adams, last month police and sanitation workers cleared more than 200 homeless camps in 12 days, offering them places in city shelters. Is this progress?
Absolutely not. And we've seen this time and time again in other jurisdictions. We've seen this throughout California, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And, it's a really dehumanizing thing. So many of those people who, may have been living in tents and whatnot, sort of get just kicked out, get their possessions taken. They've really, for a lot of people, they've set up communities, they've set up ways to sort of make what seems to be a horrible situation livable. And it's a temporary solution. It's dehumanizing the people who are actually going through the horrible experience of homelessness.
And I gather that of those more than 200 homeless camps, only 12 people actually agreed to go to the shelters, and a large number of the people who had agreed to go to shelters the previous months had left the shelters by the end of the month. So it sort of seems like these homeless sweeps are sort of theater for politicians to show we're doing something. What's the problem with this approach?
It's a temporary Band-Aid to a much more complicated situation. Kim Hopper from Columbia came up with the term the institutional circuit some time ago, and really talking about people experiencing homelessness, going from the street, going into the criminal justice system, coming back out, being hospitalized, going back into the street. And so there's a lot that's happening that folks that are experiencing homelessness are going through. And it's, the fact that they're sweeping people and they're not, where are they going? They're either going to, be pushed out into hospitals or pushed into or being arrested. It's not really addressing the issue that people don't want to be in shelter. People want homes. People want to be in a safe, comfortable home.
So what should we be doing about these? I'm talking about the street people now, who are mostly men. What should we be doing about them? From time to time, we hear that the solution is single occupancy units with support systems in place. But does that happen? Has that happened?
The average person experiencing homelessness in the city of New York is a family. It's children. The most common age that someone is in shelter is infancy. And, it's an important caveat, because I think so much of that conversation has been defined around folks who've been inconvenienced because someone might be going through psychosis or an issue on the subway and it's interrupted their trip. But that's a really small fraction of the 20% of folks who are experiencing homelessness who are on the street. And so I think, we really have to change our way we're thinking about the problem of homelessness and housing insecurity, that it's this much larger thing. And that there are, a few folks that are, going through issues that are on the street and maybe, going through it, whatever the case may be, but they're the minority. One thing that we do know is once you get people housed in permanent housing of some sort, it really reduces a lot of these mental health concerns and behavioral health issues. And so just, forcing them into a shelter where it could be congregate, where there's other people going through other extreme issues maybe as well. Maybe they've been taken away from a community, like in the encampments that you talked about, where they've created community. Now they're being thrown into something completely different. And
Now,
shelters are highly regulated spaces.
now, most of your research, I gather, has been focused on the families, the people who are in the shelters. Now, we hear all about how horrible the shelters are where the single men go. But the shelters that you have been in that are housing families, are they better?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Like, what does better mean?
But what
And
are they like? What are they like?
I mean, there's so many shelters. They're so different. Each the way the city does it. It's not like the city is actually running the shelter. The city contracts out to nonprofit private providers that provide the services. So you just have a really wide variance. But I will say, from my experience and from talking to young people, it's not a place where you want to be, right? I mean, it's better than being, I think, on the street in the cold in the winter. But we've seen time and time again complaints about, you know, uh, vermin and just decrepit sort of conditions. And if you're a family, it's better than being in a congregate unit, but it's still kind of a congregate unit because the families that I've worked with, some of the largest families in the city of New York experiencing homelessness, you might have eight people living in a really tight 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom apartment, that's essentially a shelter, or you might have 6, 7 people living in like a studio kind of situation with bunk beds. So it's better in the sense that you're with your tribe, you're with your family, and not necessarily a complete stranger. But the conditions still are very challenging, and you know just time and time again speaking to young people, it's really.
I gather you got interested in this whole subject by observing what the lives of children in these shelters. Tell me about that.
Well, actually, I got into this in my former life. I was an elementary school teacher, and I had students who were experiencing homelessness, but I didn't comprehend what that meant because they didn't look like the person that I had stereotypically associated with experiencing housing instability right on the train. They were well dressed, they are neighbors. There's an article I just was reading earlier today about a woman who was a teacher with her daughter in shelter. And so, um, but I also realized that there was behavioral issues that the kids were going through because of their living circumstances, because of the instability. And that's really what got me into thinking about this and thinking about what's happening in shelter environments and how is that impacting the ways that young people grow and develop.
Now, you have said that what the people who are homeless and the people who are living in shelters really need is guaranteed income. And I think you've talked about, I mean, for example, giving $1,000 to each youth or to each adult. How can you see that? How would that work in your mind?
Yeah. So I think one of the big things I like to point out too is that giving someone guaranteed income isn't going to fix all the issues that folks are dealing with homelessness, but it's a good weapon. As Dr. King alludes to in his text, where do we go from here? It's not the panacea per se, but it's a powerful weapon for people who are experiencing poverty and also racism. Often, the overwhelming majority of people who are experiencing homelessness in New York are Black and Latinx. And so, yes, it's not going to fix it, but it's a powerful weapon. How can we use it to prevent? I've been part of some work.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is how would that work? I mean, would it be how would it work?
So a great example of it is what's happened in Vancouver. There was an experiment where they gave people experiencing homelessness, street homelessness, $7,500 Canadian, and found dramatic results, drops in substance abuse usage, drops in behavioral health issues, and it was a one-time lump sum in that case.
It
But
was
I
a
think a lot of,
one-time lump sum.
well, in that
Okay.
case, it was a one-time lump sum, but a lot of places are thinking about doing it in monthly installments.
And what did the people do with the money? I mean, how did their lives change as a result?
They bought clothes and like paid for housing things and like did everything like any one of us who's probably watching your show would do when when they got money to get the basic needs. And it goes against the sort of the trope of like, oh, if you give folks that are going through these issues, if you give them this money, they're going to buy it on drugs. And that was totally not the case. There was a significant drop in substance abuse usage.
Were these people
Because
who were living on the street, or were they people who were in shelters?
I believe it was a mixture of
Okay,
folks on street homeless and also in shelter.
okay. And they found a dramatic improvement in their situations?
Yeah, and I think one of the really surprising pieces of the study was that $7,500 Canadian is not a lot. It may seem like if we're just talking about it like off, like but the amount of money that the city spends, at least on the family side, it's about $200 a night to stay in shelter. Even more than that to stay in hotels. So that's been a topic that lots of people have questions about, like, oh, what if we put people in hotels and they're paying $300-400 maybe a night when they could just be giving folks money.
Is this a program that is continuing, that is going on now? And how did they decide who would get $7,500?
So it's one of a movement of experiments. I believe it's phasing down, winding down. There's a host of different ones happening or in the process of happening. There's one in New York that's targeting youth experiencing homelessness. There's some in California that are too. And then there's a whole group of these sort of guaranteed income cash transfer experiments happening across the country in varying ways, targeting various populations. There's one that just released in Baltimore that my research team is helping with the evaluation of, that's targeting parents 18 to 24. So it just depends on the jurisdiction and how they've decided to really use cash as a mechanism, as an intervention.
I gather you're going to be studying how some of these programs are working and how efficacious they were and all that. Very, very interesting. Now, back to a question I was asking you before. As long as I've been in New York City, 40 years or so, people have been talking about the need for supported living, SRO type, but with nice SRO places with supported living. Is the city doing that? Do you see the city doing that?
Yeah, I mean, there's amazing organizations out there that have supportive housing programs and units, Women in Need. A lot of these different orgs. I think part of the challenge though is that not everyone needs supportive services. If I was on the street right now, it's decent out kind of now, but if it was 20 degrees and I was by myself and I've been out there for weeks, and knowing the kind of person I am, I would be horribly depressed and miserable. And but does that mean that I necessarily need supportive services once I get housed? And I think that's sort of this thing where it's like, yes, there are people who totally could benefit from supportive services. And there's the overwhelming majority though don't need that. They just need a place to sleep at night.
Okay.
That's safe and secure.
Okay. I understand from something I was reading that the Housing Authority, New York Housing Authority, has actually set aside 2,000 apartments for the homeless. And in addition to that, there are in the city 2,500 units of supportive housing available for the homeless. But the problem is that there's so much red tape in moving homeless people in. Like in New York, you have to have the approval of 15 different agencies to do anything. Do you agree that that's a problem? And I mean, it seems ridiculous, if you have housing units available, if you have people who need them, but they're not getting in there because of red tape.
The people who need supportive housing the most are the ones that are going to be the most challenging to get into it because of the red tape, right? If I'm someone that is going through psychosis and going through issues, it's going to be hard to get me, evaluated, get someone to fill out all the paperwork. I probably don't have my paperwork because of my behavioral health issue, and I'm on the street or whatever the case is. So yes, for those populations, it's really challenging to go through the supportive housing process. I've done it before with clients and residents in shelter, and it is rigorous.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time, and there's lots of T's to be crossed and I's to be dotted.
Can you see a way that could be speeded up? I mean, to get through all of that process more quickly?
This is an issue that a lot of jurisdictions run into. And I think that's why in our toolkit for this guaranteed income is a great lever to be able to use, because it's not that, again, that it's going to just completely solve the issue, but people having that extra amount of funds can get really creative about how they want to secure themselves, right? Where they can decide, you know what, maybe I can, maybe that $1,000 is not going to pay for rent, but it might allow me to, couch surf for a little bit, or stay with a family member in a room and pay $400 or $500 a month, right? Enough, just something to help stabilize. While government is working on figuring out how can we streamline the process, because the ultimate issue is that there's not enough affordable housing units
Right.
as a whole.
The city used to use hotels at at exorbitant cost to house the homeless, and they were not very great places to live. But since the pandemic, I gather, has left the city with a number of vacant hotels. And so is that a possibility of renovating these hotels for people to live in a decent way?
Yeah, I think that's a great usage of hotels that have been closed. Another option that people have thought about is the high vacancies in Midtown. The challenge with that, and you're at the grad center, is that their buildings weren't designed for people to live in, so
Right.
it's incredibly expensive to wire everything for that. The hotels a little bit less so, but I think it's important that it's not just a room that people live in, but it's something that's comfortable and safe and secure.
I understand that I guess the federal government has given the city 8,000 new Section 8 vouchers, which people can take to landlords. The government pays a portion of the rent under Section 8. But the problem has always been that a lot of landlords don't want to take Section 8 vouchers. I don't know if you can force them to do that. What do you do about that?
So there's a host of things you can do. So I think the real issue is again housing, and one of the housing choice vouchers, Section 8, the program. Yes, it's better than a lot of other options. It's not perfect, because if I'm a mom and I have Section 8 and I've been on it for XYZ and something happens to me, my kids don't inherit my Section 8 home, right? And so like that voucher it's not equity in a home. So there's that. The other piece about sort of landlord discrimination, this goes back to King's comment about this sort of these sort of intersecting identities, right? About being poor, but also being a person of color. And so those things are intersecting as people are trying to go to their landlords. And so one thing that we could do that the city hasn't, invested a whole lot in is enforcement of, making sure that those landlords are abiding by what they should be doing to accept those Section 8 vouchers. Right now, the enforcement for landlords is relatively weak, and they know they can get away with it.
Are they required to accept a Section 8 voucher? Is that a legal requirement?
No, but it is illegal to deny someone housing under fair housing law, because of economic status or race or whatever the case is. But the enforcement of that has to be ramped up, for us to really be able to get people to use them at full capacity.
Yeah. One hears about, I mean, New York City is not the only city that has a housing problem. Obviously, you hear about homeless people living on the streets in Los Angeles and other cities. Are there places that you know of or that you have seen that you feel have done a good job with getting homeless people into housing? I see you're having to think about that.
Right. Are you asking in America or are you asking in general?
In America, but if you can't find anybody in America, are there other places where you've seen that are doing a good job?
You know, there's places in America that are doing, phenomenal jobs. The issue is that what is happening in Seattle, New York, Los Angeles, the Bay Area is so much larger than those I was just at a housing conference last week, and it was a gentleman presenting on how they've cut the homeless population in Milwaukee. But the homeless population in Milwaukee, in like right now, is the size, it's less than the amount of people who are in my shelter, like my one shelter. And there's
Right.
hundreds of shelters in New York, plus the people on the streets. So big cities that have done it, I think Vienna has a really interesting way that they've gone about the expansion of affordable
Where is
housing.
this
There's kind
now?
of
Where?
Vienna, Austria.
Oh, okay.
But in the US, I think there's places that are doing great jobs, but the population is nowhere near
Yeah.
what it is in Los Angeles and in New York City.
Every mayoral administration that I've known since I've been in New York, every governor, every president has talked about the need to solve the homeless problem. So why doesn't it get done?
Um, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that the real issue is affordable housing. And the real issue is how do we expand that in a way that allows everyone to have a safe and secure place to live. And I think it's been a challenge to get industry and business, wanting to invest in these things because sometimes it's not always the biggest profit margins to build affordable housing units. Um, and so until we've built more affordable housing at the middle and lower ends, and I mean like working class middle and lower ends, there's not enough housing stock.
It also requires a certain amount of political will
Absolutely.
to put pressure on the developers to build the housing, correct? Really affordable housing.
Yeah. And I think one of the sort of interesting things about New York is because we have a right to shelter under the Callahan consent decree, everyone theoretically that wants to get a bed is supposed to get one. There's data that came out about people being turned away from PATH, the family intake center. I think it's 1 out of 4 actually get accepted because they get turned away for XYZ. But the way the system has been legally set up is that supposedly everyone that needs a bed can get a bed. And the problem is that our answer to housing instability has been shelter, and it hasn't been affordable housing. And so we have built an incredibly massive
Shelter
homelessness
system.
system that is bigger than anywhere else in the world, quite frankly. It's a $3 to $4 billion a year industry just under the DHS budget. It's even bigger than that when you think about all the other entities that are tied to it in terms of behavioral health, police, et cetera. And so yeah, there's not an incentive for folks to really move away from that, to really stop building shelters and build more affordable housing.
Yeah. Now, I realize you're not the mayor or the governor, but if you had to propose I don't know, 5-point, 6-point, 3-point program to tackle homelessness in New York City, what steps would you take? And you've got about 2 minutes to explain that.
I would do two things immediately. I would have cash transfers and rapid, what we call housing first programs, where there's teams going around. We're trying to get people's houses as quickly as possible. And housing first is not permanent housing per se, but it's getting people into housing and then giving them services and whatever they need. But the first thing is just getting them into housing and then assessing what folks need. And the way what that can look like is like the city could buy or could just say like, you know what, we're going to lease up, all these units and we're just going to start, sending people to them. And then as they're in them, begin also, having people come in and giving services, whatnot. And then other groups, maybe they don't even need that. Maybe a guaranteed income would help stabilize them. And there's a whole array of needs. And so what one person needs is not what the other person may need. There may be someone that, we put them in that housing for a few months and we recognize that, what, they need something more intense than this. And so we may need to put them in permanent supportive housing program, but now we're going to help them get to that point. And, but using that as the first place and not saying, you know what, we're going to grab them off the street and force them into a shelter. No, we're going to help work with them and talk with them, see what they want, which is often housing, and, help subsidize their housing for a little bit until we can stabilize them and figuring out what's the best next step for them to go.
Henry, as a developmental psychologist, what do you bring to this whole discussion of how we should deal with the homeless?
I think that people think about folks experiencing homelessness, that one incident when they see them on the train, and they don't think about who were they when they were a kid? Who were they when they were a teenager? How did they end up in this position? There was an article that came out about this woman who passed away, and it was from the New York Times about like, who was she? Where did she come from? She had a history. She didn't overnight just end up here. And so I think it's really important to think about this issue, often thought about in economic terms. What does it mean for a developing human? What does it mean for a child, an infant, a senior to experience this? And it means different things at different points in the life course.
How did they get there?
Yes.
And how could they have been prevented from getting there?
Yes. And if you start talking to a lot of folks that are on the street or experiencing it in shelters, they've probably experienced it as a young person or as a child or as an infant. And I think there's just this assumption that, we're not going to think about those children and infants and whoever that are in shelters. We're just going to focus on the man on the street. But the man on the street started from somewhere. And we see those trends.
Well, thank you for your comments, and I look forward to the results of your ongoing research on this issue. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Henry Love, a doctoral student in developmental psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center and a researcher on the psychological dynamics of race and homelessness, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.